in 7-6, 5-4, 3-2, 1, begin.
The story of Eve eating the apple in the Garden of Eden is found in Genesis 3 of the Bible. While tradition has often interpreted the fruit as an apple, the text itself simply calls it the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Here's a direct breakdown of what happened and how your question can be explored from both canonical and esoteric Taos traditional perspectives. Biblical, canonical version, Genesis 3. Satan, in the form of a serpent, tempts Eve by saying she will not die if she eats the fruit, but will be like God, knowing good and evil. Eve sees that the fruit is good for food, pleasing to the eye, and desirable for gaining wisdom. She eats it, then gives some to Adam. There is no explicit mention of Eve giving something to Satan in return. The act is portrayed as disobedience to God's command, not a transactional deal. Esoteric, Gnostic interpretations, in alternative traditions, such as Gnosticism, Kabbalistic lore, or later occult interpretations, the story can carry additional meanings. 1. Gnostic view. Some Gnostic texts reverse the roles. The serpent is seen as a bringer of enlightenment, and Yahweh is the jealous demiurge who keeps humanity ignorant. In this reading, Eve's deal is more like accepting forbidden knowledge or aligning with a liberator, not Satan in the traditional sense. Mystical Jewish and Christian lore. Some midrashic or mystical interpretations suggest the serpent seduced Eve. Some even say sexually. This is not in the Bible, but appears in apocryphal and folkloric traditions. In some Christian demonological traditions, Eve's act allowed Satan to gain a foothold in humanity, interpreted as opening the gates of sin and death to the world. What did Eve give in return? If you interpret the story symbolically or spiritually, she gave her innocence and trust in God's word. She invited self-awareness, desire, shame, and eventually mortality into human experience. She gave Satan influence over humanity according to Christian theology, Romans 5:12. In esoteric terms, some argue she offered the human soul or spiritual essence as a cost of knowledge. In occult or Luciferian interpretations, knowledge itself is the currency. Deeper symbolism, the fruit, forbidden knowledge, power, sexual awakening, or spiritual autonomy. Satan, the serpent, trickster, liberator, adversary, or inner ego. Eve-Xian, the human soul or divine feminine. But if you're working on a fictional or symbolic retelling, which you've done before, you might frame Eve's gift to Satan not as a physical exchange, but something more profound. The awakening of self-awareness, loss of divine protection, or even the willingness to seek forbidden truth, which in some esoteric frameworks is seen as the first act of rebellion against spiritual ignorance. Would you like me to write a dramatized or mythological version of this as a script or graphic novel passage?
Analysis at a PhD level, analyzing the content that was just presented in the video, and that is how we will conclude, is with a PhD level analysis, so sit back and enjoy for the next few minutes as we dive a bit deeper into the concept. The story of Adam and Eve, found in Genesis 2-3, is one of the most archetypal and symbolically dense narratives in the Judeo-Christian tradition. It forms the cornerstone of Christian doctrines such as original sin, yet it also transcends its religious context to reflect broader themes of human identity, moral consciousness, and the dialectic of freedom and obedience. A comprehensive analysis requires a multidisciplinary approach, incorporating ancient Near Eastern mythology, literary structure, theological interpretation, and philosophical anthropology. Textual structure and literary form. The Adam and Eve narrative is split into two primary pericopes: the formation of humanity, Genesis 2, and the transgression in Eden, Genesis 3. These chapters derive from the Yahwist, Judge, source, written circa 10th century BCE. Unlike Genesis 1, from the priestly source, which presents a cosmic ordered creation, Genesis 2-3 is anthropocentric and intimate, portraying God as a craftsman forming man from dust, afar, and breathing into his nostrils the breath of life, neshama. The narrative structure is a classic chiasmus, with Eden at the center. The plot progresses from harmony and naming, Gen 2:19-20, to temptation and fall, Gen 3, to the expulsion from the garden, restoring a new order based on estrangement. The serpent woman man God interrogation sequence, Gen 3:9-13, mirrors the judgment sequence in reverse, suggesting moral symmetry but also tragic inversion. Theological themes, free will, and moral knowledge. Central to the narrative is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which symbolizes not merely ethical knowledge, but the autonomy of moral judgment, apart from divine command. Adam and Eve are not punished for acquiring knowledge per se. Indeed, the text hints that God acknowledges their new moral awareness, Gen 3:22, but for transgressing a divine boundary. The act marks a rupture in the divine-human relationship, with autonomy asserted over obedience. However, Jewish tradition, notably Maimonides, emphasizes the acquisition of rational moral discernment. The rabbinic term, Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination, is not innate depravity, but a necessary, channelable impulse, gender, and hierarchy. The creation of Eve from Adam's rib, Selah, has often been misused to justify patriarchal dominance. However, the Hebrew word can also mean side, suggesting partnership. The initial declaration, Ezer Kenegdo, a helper corresponding to him, implies equality, not subordination. The later rule over you, Gen 3:16, is a consequence of sin, not a creation ordinance. Feminist theologians like Phyllis Tribal and Carol Myers have argued that patriarchy emerges from the fall, not from divine intent. Theodicy and alienation, the expulsion from Eden, explains why suffering, toil, and death exist in the world. A theodicy through narrative. Adam must toil in cursed soil. Eve experiences pain in childbirth. The serpent crawls in dust. But these curses are not absolute. Clothing is provided, life continues, and Eden's gate is guarded, not destroyed, implying a future eschatological restoration, echoed in Revelation 22. Symbolic and psychological interpretation. Jungian and Freudian readings find in Genesis 3 a symbolic coming-of-age tale. The garden is a state of preconscious innocence. The fruit represents the emergence of ego and self-awareness. The knowledge of good and evil is not sexual awakening per se, but a binary moral consciousness, a necessary part of individuation. The serpent, as trickster archetype, introduces dialectic, ambivalence, ambiguity, and choice. The sense of nakedness is also symbolic. In ancient Semitic cultures, nudity conveyed vulnerability and shame only in the context of guilt or exile. Their clothing, made of animal skins, marks the beginning of civilization, even as it signals a loss of paradise. Political and cultural subtext. Some scholars argue Genesis 2-3 is a post-exilic critique of Babylonian priestly power and goddess worship. The serpent sacred in Mesopotamian cults, e.g., Ningish Zida, is demoted to deceiver. The woman's elevated role in ancient fertility cults is diminished here. Thus, the Eden story subtly replaces Mesopotamian mythic theology with a monotheistic moral framework. YHWH alone gives life, law, and land. Additionally, Adam, Hebrew, Adam, is not a proper name originally, but a term meaning human or earthling, from the ground. Adamah, Eve, Hawa, is mother of all living, positioning her as the prototype of civilization, not merely as a temptress. Their names are mythopoeic, not biographical.